Hello and welcome to this video presentation about projects, project management and sustainability. At the end of this video presentation there will be an invitation to you to reflect upon what you've heard and what you've learned and how this presentation might be useful to you in a variety of ways. So let's get into it. We can see here that projects have become very ubiquitous. We can see that I've taken this from Microsoft Office, that there's a sort of a standard template that you can use in Microsoft Office to make a presentation about a project. And we see here that's the project roadmap, and we see that there's sort of very different kinds of steps in it. But the agenda having to do with this is first, what is a project? What is meant by project management? And what do I mean by the projectification of sustainability? First of all, we have to understand the past to understand the present. If we look back in time about what is meant by project or project, a verb, it was originally that we want to project something. We are going to project force. We're going to send a projectile away like that. And it's something we throw forward, and it's something we plan. We plan our throw to get it to the place where we want it to be. And in military terms, we have projectiles of various kinds that we could have a cannonball, which is a projectile, that we project force at a particular distance. And so a project, taking away from the idea of a projectile, was originally something that we plan and we prepare for. And we plan and prepare to reach an objective. There's some sort of difficulty involved in that. Maybe an object or more than one objective. Generally, when we talked about a project or a project in the past, this would be something that was not already occurring. A project would be like an adventure of some kind. A project would be something that was unique. A project would be something which otherwise would not happen given everyday kinds of circumstances. So we would require a deliberate effort if we're going to have a project and to achieve the objective of the project. Let's take a look at some famous projects. Perhaps some of them are infamous. So I thought I'd talk about some projects, some historical projects that have made an impact on the world. Some of them are famous and some of them are infamous. Here we see a picture of an engraving which is supposed to show Christopher Columbus with soldiers arriving on one of the islands in what is now known as the West Indies. And of course, Columbus's project was to gather enough resources together and enough support to be able to leave southern Spain and go across the Atlantic and go west and reach China. That was the goal. It was very specific, and there was also the goal of trading and perhaps a goal of Christianizing, as the term perhaps could be used, to force people to accept a religion that was one's own at the time. Now, what happened? Columbus did not discover China from the European perspective. He did not discover a way to go west and reach China. What he did was he discovered for Europeans a completely large and unknown landmass, and he visited mostly islands that are now considered the West Indies. He thought that he had arrived in India. He took several voyages to the so-called New World from Spain. Each of those voyages could be considered a project itself at the time because they were not normal. Yes, the Portuguese had sailing vessels which are leaving Portugal, sailing along the west coast of Africa and eventually through the Indian Ocean and reaching India and onwards, all in the direction of China and other places in southeastern and eastern Asia and southern Asia. Columbus thought he would sort of go the other way because of his understanding that the world was probably round, but he didn't know how large the world was. But what happened with Columbus and so forth? What we have is the result which wasn't intended. The unintended result is what is referred to as the Columbian Exchange sometimes. The Europeans took potatoes and other kinds of crops with them to Europe. Later, tobacco and so forth. They also forcibly took gold and silver. The Europeans forced upon the inhabitants of the area to become Catholic Christians. And they also destroyed, directly or indirectly, a number of civilizations or empires. The Aztec, the Mayan, and the Inca. And they also gave us a sort of a gift, smallpox. You can read more about this kind of exchange in, among others, books that Jared Diamond has written about this kind of interaction. So, this was a project of some kind. We could think of the first and the other voyages he made as some sort of a project. But then, at some point in time, there were more and more people, and there were voyages that were taken with an expressed purpose. And they were no longer projects at some point in time. They became a normal way of doing things. Or at the time, they started to become normal. They became, a series of projects started to become a process and part of the normal everyday of how the Spanish Empire was expanding in the world. How about another kind of project? The project in the beginning of the 1900s, reaching the South Pole. And here we see pictures which are in the public domain. In this map, we can see here, I'll move a little closer. We can see here that there was an Englishman named Shackleton who had attempted to reach the South Pole like this in the past, and here he had turned back. Amundsen decided that he was going to establish some sort of a overwintering camp there. If he and others returned and the ship wasn't there, they needed to have supplies and a place to stay until the ship returned. And he buried supplies at some locations along the way so that he and his men who were going to the South Pole wouldn't have to take everything all the way to the South Pole. They could lighten their load and then come back to a location, and there would be some supplies that they could use there. In other words, he was very clever in his planning. As opposed to Scott, he set off for the South Pole at about the same time. He had different ideas and a different kind of planning. Amundsen took dogs that helped pull the sleds. Scott thought that it would be a good idea to take ponies. Perhaps the ponies could pull more, but of course they required more food to be able to pull that. We can also see Scott, the way he is pictured there. We can go back to Amundsen. Who do you think is more prepared to be able to explore Antarctic regions based on this? And Scott and his men, they arrive at the South Pole, and Amundsen has already been there and has left a tent with a flag. And Amundsen returns. To this day, there are some people in the world who downplay Amundsen's success and think that Scott was more valiant and that he somehow deserved to be the one who would reach the South Pole first. Perhaps the reason for this is that Amundsen did not state his intentions of going to the South Pole, and in fact his ship had the plan was something else, but he himself had a secret plan of reaching the South Pole, and the reason he, it is claimed, did not want everyone to know that he was going to the South Pole was that he wanted less competition. So the ship took a change in directions and headed for Antarctica. Most of the crew knew nothing about this. Maybe that's why some people think that Scott was more noble with his attentions. Anyway, We can see here a miserable failure. Scott did reach the South Pole. They did take a picture of this, and he and his men, or at least most of them, about the same number of men as Amundsen, took about 5, made it back most of the way, but then they died within, I don't know, some 50 or 100 kilometers from where they were going to be picked up, and their remains were discovered and the film could be developed. So we can see that the approach and the orientation that Amundsen had and how he planned everything in this project was quite different than Scott. Presumably it was also because Amundsen had more experience living in Norway and in the mountains of Norway and going to, shall we say, projects, adventures in the Arctic. He was better prepared. He had better planning, he had better skills and preparation as opposed to Scott. So there is a sort of, shall we say, almost a fetish in parts of the United Kingdom to say that Scott should have won. He was the more noble of the two. And Amundsen, since he wasn't declaring his intentions, he wasn't as gentlemanly enough. Well, Amundsen did make it to the South Pole. Admiral intentions or not, he was the better explorer. He was the one who planned and prepared his project much better. Let's go on to some other projects. Perhaps this is a project which is the first time that we have a project which has the name project in it. The Manhattan Project in the United States, the project to build nuclear fission bombs. And we can see a Colonel Graves and a Robin Oppenheimer, the two heads of the Manhattan Project. We could say that based on this picture, we could consider these two to be sort of co-project managers. The scientific manager and the sort of manpower and resources manager. The military couldn't do it on themselves and they needed to have a civilian physicist. So, moving on, we have the Manhattan Project, and this project is perhaps one of the first projects that actually has the name project in it, or at least one of the first well-known projects. And the Manhattan Project was the attempt on the part of the United States military, with help of civilians, to make the first nuclear fission bomb, test it, and then have it deployable to be used in the Second World War. We can see this Colonel Groves and Robert Oppenheimer. We can imagine that these two functioned as sort of co-project managers. They had different roles. Here we can see some of the steps along the way. Of course, there was a lot more that was taking place. Here we can see the assembly of this bomb, which was called Little Boy. Has to have some sort of a name. And of course, in the Manhattan Project, there were all kinds of things that were necessary that led to the construction of this bomb that could be used. And there was a test bomb. And so within the Manhattan Project, we could imagine that there were sub-projects, that were people who were involved in a particular part of the Manhattan Project, in a particular project, and they might not have not understood everything. They only needed to know certain things, and then when they were done with their part, they delivered the knowledge, the experience, or the prototype, or whatever it was, on to the main part of the project. And that's not uncommon, that we divide up large, long-term projects in different kinds of steps, and that certain organizations, certain groups of people work with parts of it, and they might not have the entire big picture. And here we see hanging, ready to be transported by boat across the Pacific, and then dropped over Hiroshima, Japan, in August of 1945. The Manhattan Project, in a sense, was over at that point in time, because then it was up to the military to take the bombs that they'd received and do something with them. And then we have Nagasaki several days later. the moon landings on the part of the United States were also projects. And we can call it getting a man to the moon as a project, because there were different sub-projects along the way. There were, from the United States perspective, there were the Mercury projects and the Gemini projects. The Mercury were the first manned spacecraft the United States have, and then they tested with 2 people in a space capsule of some sort. But these tests were all done first to achieve certain goals within those projects, but those goals were leading up to the Apollo project itself. Now, I'm not going to show this, but I invite you to look at these links on YouTube. We can see the first one was from 1961, when then President Kennedy of the United States was addressing the Congress. Then later on, a speech, and particularly if you go to about 9 minutes into the video, where then President Kennedy is making an address in a large stadium where there's about to be some sort of American football match. And if you watch these two, then what you will see is, or what you will hear is, and it's good to have the text on, you'll hear then President Kennedy using very specific words, talking about endeavors and gathering resources and goals and so forth. In other words, he is using project terminology, but he has put it in a political speech. And then if you look at this one, you can see a sort of filming of one of the main goals in the Gemini project, and the results of the Gemini project fed into the Apollo project. And the pictures we see at the bottom here are the sort of various steps dealing with landing people on the moon and returning them safely. And then for those that really get into this, there's a YouTube clip here where you can see the so-called lunar module returning back and going into orbit around the moon. And then we can see the last liftoff from the moon there. The Apollo project was over. Actually, the Apollo project was originally intended to last longer than 1972. There were supposed to be additional moon landings, but the United States Congress decided to cut the funding there. Of all the landings on the moon which took place between 1969 and 1972, only one of the astronauts was a trained scientist. Most of them were pilots that then flew the aircraft and were given tasks to do on the moon. There was an astronaut who was a trained geologist. It would make sense to maybe have a geologist walking around on the moon and saying, let's take a sample of that rock. I think that would be interesting. That there would be some sort of knowledge based on the decision of which rock to take, whereas the astronauts had much more rudimentary geologic knowledge. So perhaps the Apollo project, seen in this light, wasn't so much a scientific endeavor, but much more of, shall we say, a technical and maybe a military-industrial complex kind of endeavor. What about some more recent projects? We move into the 1980s. We have what is referred to as the Human Genome Project. And the original idea for this was sort of pitched. That's a common term to talk about. You're going to pitch an idea. You have 3 minutes. You're going to present the idea and convince somebody that it's a good idea and maybe that you should be doing this, or that somebody should be spending money to do this. And this was then taken up by, among others, the United States government. And the goal of the Human Genome Project was to identify, sequence, and understand the functionality of all the genes in the entire human genome. Humans have a variety of chromosomes, and on each chromosome there are the genes that have certain kinds of functions. They code for certain things. Formally, this was started in 1990, the project. In other words, it took time to marshal all the resources in terms of money, but also in terms of people to start this. And then this became not just the United States government, but the International Human Genome Sequencing Consortium, as it was called. And so you had 20 universities in at least 6 countries that were the ones that did most of the work for this Human Genome Project. And there were companies which were founded, sort of spun off from this development. And then in 2003, this was formally declared as being complete. The project was over. But was it? At least according to sources that I have read, it wasn't actually until 2022 when all the original goals were actually achieved. So what we see here is that somebody declared everything was over in 2003 because it must have been that most of the genes were identified, sequenced, and understood, but some of them were not. It was approximately like this, that something on the lines of 80 to 90% of this was achieved by about 2003, and then there was 10 to 20%, which was more difficult, was achieved in the end. So the question is, was the project, I'm sure it was very planned and prepared, but maybe they were over-optimistic, or maybe they just needed to declare it being done, even though it really wasn't done, and the International Human Genome Sequencing Consortium at some point after 2003 was done. But there were individual people that continued with individual research afterwards. So this is a project. This project probably would not have occurred unless there were several people that gathered together and pitched the idea to an organization that might be sympathetic to this, so that it would be possible to gather resources and to achieve the goals. And the goals have to be established, and these goals maybe were originally established when the first idea was pitched. Sometimes we have a much vaguer kind of project that's pitched, and then part of the very beginning of the project is to determine more specifically very specific goals and a timeline. How about another kind of project? It's 2025 when I'm talking about this, and many people who are watching this in the 2020s have fresh in their memory so-called COVID-19. And here we can see a picture of the virus, and here we can see the vaccination card, and syringe, and so forth. Some pictures here. We can see that that there were several projects which were carried out in a short period of time to develop and test vaccines and then make it available to the public in various places around the world. And various countries then decided who to prioritize, who to get the vaccine first. This was a series of projects which was taking place sort of in parallel, because if it is a novel virus or a novel problem, then maybe you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. Maybe you want to have several different ideas about how we can solve this project in competing projects. If we had enough time, then maybe it could have been that there could have been several different attempts to do this, and the one that appeared most promising, everyone dropped everything else and then put all their resources into that. So this was actually several projects which were carried out in parallel. And there were other things which occurred in connection with COVID-19 which could have been considered projects. That you have a period of time that you have countries, among others in Western Europe, that had, and the companies that had outsourced all of their medical mask protection and all kinds of other things to other places in the world for production, because no one had thought that there could be a sudden pandemic. Then you had some countries like Finland, based on their experiences with various kinds of war, that decided to keep stockpiles of simple medical equipment, disposable masks and so forth, in case something happened. And then we have right beside it a country like Sweden that decided, we'll just let the market decide everything here, and that we can always buy something from China, and we can always buy something at the last moment, and there'll always be something there, and we don't need to have those kinds of stores and supplies. Sweden wasn't alone in this, but the contrast between Finland and Sweden was very striking. Based on different experiences, the Finns had, as part of everyday operations, a number of locations around the country where certain things were stored in the event of a medical emergency. Sweden did not do that, even though in many ways, up until the 1800s, Sweden and Finland had a very similar kind of history. It's the 1800s and the 1900s, which were quite different for the two countries, that led to a different kind of planning and different kinds of scenarios of what be needed. Now, of course, we have a situation where at the EU level there's a decision that was made, even though it wasn't originally part of EU competency, it was supposed to be each nation state. The decision has been made that there should be locations within EU countries of storing some kind of equipment, not just for that particular country, but for neighboring countries in case of a pandemic in the future. That's something that maybe you've learned. And also could be because of Putin's war of aggression against Ukraine. We see some sort of difference there. And so we see the processes involved in procurement and planning of everyday activities seem to have been changed. But to achieve that, there have been a number of projects which have been carried out in a number of countries to do things differently, and then the project transforms into something which is more everyday kinds of activities. So we can see that we've had a series of different kinds of projects. Sometimes they have a name as a project, but not all of them had that as a name. I mean, Columbus didn't say to Spanish nobility, give me some ships and some men and some money, and I'm going to go out on my project. He probably talked about an adventure. I don't, of course, know the words that he used, and maybe nobody knows. But what more can we see here? What can we see about... We can see that projects have a clear start and a clear end. And the clear start here is represented by the so-called Vasaloppet, held once a year in Sweden. And then there are some places around the world which have created their own cross-country skiing Vasalopp in Minnesota in the United States. But, I mean, this is the original. Projects then have a focus, usually. We've heard about some of these projects. We have the Manhattan Project, there was a clear focus. Getting the man on the moon, there was a clear focus. The COVID-19 vaccinations, there was a clear focus. But how they went about to get a successful vaccine was a little different from company and university to university. But we could roll several different tasks and put them together into one project. One task might be a building block for another one. And that is the focus. We're looking at particular things that don't get us to what we want to do, we leave outside. We may unintentionally deal with it, but we're not really interested in that. We can note that. Maybe somebody will take that up later on. There are usually things which are called milestones, and here we have a picture here where we can see on this road someplace a Pedro Cassandra has taken a picture of a milestone, a distance marker from a start to an end on a road, and that's and we use the British and American archaic distance measurement unit of a mile here. A milestone. We are going to accomplish certain things at certain times. In fact, sometimes the milestones is that we move forward and complete one task, and then that group of people is done doing that and say, almost like a baton in a race, we're done with this, here you go. And then it's the next group which does something with that. Or there are several things which are given to the next group to continue doing that. So these are milestones. And what is accomplished at a particular period of time is often called a deliverable. And a deliverable is something you would have at the end of the project, but you could have something which would be a deliverable someplace along the way, like I said here. That's something which is completed, a prototype or part of the final good or service or whatever it is that's going to be made is passed on to another member of the project for the next step. And it could be, it's within a company that several people in a company pass it on to somebody else, but it could also be, if you have a consortium of several different companies, that you could have some people in a company that are done with what they're supposed to do, and then they hand it over to people in another company to do something. And that other company could be in a different branch, could be in a different country. Normally these two companies might be competitors, but they've decided to get together, and that they will then deal with the final result together and try to be profitable in selling that in the future. Projects have structures, and projects usually have a project manager, and usually to be successful, many times it's said that you should have one person who's the manager all the way through. That person is starting everything out and has a clear idea about how to reach the end, and experiences along the way success or problems. And because this person has an overview of the entire project, if there are problems along the way, this person will be able to say, okay, this is taking much longer than I thought, this part here, or I and other people I spoke to. So now it's time for me as the project manager to rearrange some things because there's a bottleneck, something which is slowing everything else down. We have to get done with that so everyone else is sitting and waiting can take over the next step. Besides having a structure, and like I said before, the clear start and end focus, milestones and deliverables, and a project manager, projects typically have an owner or a group of owners. We had the Human Genome Project, where there was a consortium of different organizations which went together and sort of became the owner of all this. There were certain activities which took place at certain universities in certain countries around the world, but there was a group of owners. And sometimes, if it's a group of owners of the project, and the owner isn't necessarily the case that they actually legally own something, like I own my watch or I own the building, but it is the organization which is in some way funding and making sure that this actually is going to occur. Sometimes there is an oversight group or an oversight board which meets the project manager, or in some cases project managers, from time to time to sort of check how things are going. If the project manager is saying that, okay, A, B, and C here in the beginning is going according to plan, but based on B being slightly slower than I thought, then I'm a little worried that D, E, F, and G later on, maybe F is going to be a little slower than we originally thought. And so the consortium keeps this in mind, knowing that maybe in a year from now, maybe more resources will be necessary in the project. So the original idea, of course, was that the project that one would do was different from regular activities. The Spanish Empire wasn't paying people to take ships to sail across the Atlantic to the west to get to China. So that was something completely different. The Manhattan Project, a nuclear bomb made by the United States, was very different from regular activities that were happening, and something was going to be developed. And we can see other kinds of projects. Of course, when it comes to, for example, the vaccine against COVID-19, it could have been possible to develop an RNA vaccination for some other disease before that, I presume. But because of the great demands for public health that were placed on various organizations, it became clear that it would be an idea to try doing that and applying that understanding to this particular disease. And it apparently worked. Now, from once upon a time, when we had projects where there were resources which were put together to do something different from regular activities, the resources being people, money, and facilities, and a project was a one-off kind of thing. This was very different than the regular activities in an organization or in a particular location, say in a country. But what's happened now is that the word project and the way organizations are organized, at least some of them, what we can see that projects, the word project and the idea of projects have become so common that, in a sense, projects have taken over regular activities in business and local government. So this means that in part the meaning of the word project has changed, but also the meaning of the practice. If it becomes regular activities in a business or in local government, that certain things are done on a project basis, short-term, gathering people together who otherwise are doing other things, and they spend part of their working hours doing things in a project-based form while they're the rest of the time doing other kinds of regular activities. We can have a change in regular activities, and this is put together in a project. So you have, say, a particular kind of software which is being used in an organization, to take an example. And there's an understanding that there are some problems with the software. So you create a project, and that you have a project manager who might be a person with a lot of experience in software development. And this person puts together a team. Maybe you would have representatives with different functions in the organization that use the software in a different way. If you don't like the word your software, then we can say app, if you prefer that. And then you try to figure out what's wrong. And that's one of the parts of the steps in the project. And then the project manager is given resources to try to make changes in the software that will make it more efficient and to sort of meet the needs and the problems that were identified by the groups initially. So the project actually has several different steps. First of all, better describing the problem, and then two, creating a prototype to solve it, and then presumably testing it. So you can see that this becomes some sort of an isolated but important part of regular activities. That it's designed in some places as a project. In other cases, it would be maybe considered a regular activity that every third year we look at how this particular software is used and what other problems there are, and then in a 3-year cycle we make some sort of changes. And it's not a project. We just do this. It's part of our regular activities. Now, for those of you who are listening to this, who are taking part in the course at Malmö University, Sweden, MV 241E, you have some course books and some articles. And one of the course books is by somebody called Dransfeld. And the whole book is strangely silent about what projects are. Yes, the author of the book refers to projects and assumes that you already know what a project is and how they work. And he talks about comparing projects and their profitability, but doesn't talk about projects per se. In another one of the textbooks by Mulvihill and Ali about environmental management, projects and project management are not so important parts of the book, so they don't talk about it. And in some kinds of organization, projects are very important in understanding how work is organized and how an organization develops. If you have a software company, depending upon how it's organized, they can have specific ways of organizing projects that we talk about, where they talk about scrumming, which I think is a term from rugby, and you have a scrum master who's the project manager, at least for a period of time. And this is a kind of project where you quickly develop the beginning of a prototype because you can't wait to the end. Whereas many projects, you do all these things and then you have your deliverable and the next group takes over it. In this sort of software scrumming, it's a different way of organizing your project. So in these two course books, there's really nothing about projects, and so there's sort of a gap there. There could be other literature that talk more about projects. And in fact, there is, as I say here, a vast academic and practical how-to literature about projects and project management. You can buy thin little books, only about this size, little thin, that are sort of like, the project manager could always have that little book with herself or himself in a briefcase together with a laptop. And when there starts to be a problem, go back and look at the book. Okay, right, I should maybe think about this, and so forth. And since this lecture, which is part of a course, has a limited number of credits, we're going to limit ourselves here. This is sort of just an overview about projects and project management. And have to save time to relate projects and project management to sustainability, which is important for the course, but is also something, I think, which is rather important for anyone thinking about sustainable development or sustainability. So using this literature here, and at the end you'll see the actual references here. According to the literature review carried out by these researchers in 2008, they divide different kinds of projects into different types. Projects have owners, as I said otherwise, but they talk about projects being subordinate to parent organizations. And the degree to which a project is subordinate to one parent organization or is sort of has several organizations which own it. How autonomous is the project, tightly or loosely, closely connected to one or parent organizations? And also, what about the unclear but evolving relationship to surroundings and stakeholders, the organizations and the project carried out of them? If that's very much under development, that means that the project can look quite different. And so the article suggests that there's a dimension which could be referred as autonomy versus the number of main stakeholders. So we see here is that if there's one main stakeholder, or if there are several, then it's different parts of the table, and how independent the project is, if it's low or if it's high. And this divides the project into 4 different types. And the words that they use here are not just the project, but also the qualities that might be necessary for the project manager that's going to be put into place to deal with the project. So let's try to relate this to you as a university student. You as a university student, assuming that's who you are watching this, you have assignments during an undergraduate university education in various kinds of courses. You could be assigned to read something. You could carry out some sort of investigation. You could be a group and do that. You might have parallel courses, or one large course with parallel kinds of assignments. And those assignments are projects of some kind. And typically, at the start of an educational program in a university, we would see that your assignment, your project would be perhaps of this kind. How many stakeholders are? Well, you have the person in charge of the course. That is the stakeholder. But it's also, if it's just you yourself, you become also in some sense a stakeholder because you want to pass. And that means you don't have all that much independence. You're given some sort of assignment and you do this, and there are probably limited ways you can do this, and you may have even told that you need to use this literature, you need to use this model, this theory, these concepts, and so forth. And so that means that you are presumably an obedient servant. Yes, professor, I will do this. But then when we reach the end of an undergraduate university education, then what we see that in some cases some sort of large assignment is done by one student, or perhaps a group, a very small, a pair of students. Sometimes this could be called a bachelor's thesis, something along those lines. And typically you start out with there being perhaps the person who's in charge of the bachelor's thesis course as being a strong stakeholder. But then you meet one or more advisors, and you might be advised, receive advice or tutorial sessions in a group. The other people in your group are not stakeholders, but they're people that are doing something. They're doing another kind of assignment, but there might be some sort of overlap. Somebody might be using a similar method or a similar theory to you, but you're studying something completely different. Or you might be studying something similar, but somebody else, other students, are using other theoretical points of departure and other methods opposed to you, because you have somewhat different questions, but you're looking at more or less the same area. So this means that towards the end of the educational program, you move away from being an obedient servant, and you might be moving in the direction of an independent innovator. Most of the advisors want you to do that. They want you to start to think more on your own, and the advisor is there to say, why are you going to use that method? Why is collecting that data important? It isn't the person is necessarily saying that's a bad idea. The person is holding up a mirror to you and saying, why? And then you can say, yeah, I didn't think about that. I just thought it was obvious. And then the tutor will be saying, why did you think it was obvious? The tutor's role is to try to help you stay on a path and maybe in some cases help you clear out a path in front by suggesting, well, I can see where I think you want to go. You might want to read this article. Maybe not. Maybe you don't find that useful, but I, as someone who's more experienced, think that based on what you're saying, you might want to check this article out. It might be helpful to you, or maybe not. It's your job in the end. So we can see, and if you're a student who's listening to this, if you want to be more successful in your university studies at the undergraduate level, then maybe you could start viewing some of your undergraduate studies as a series of projects. Each course is a project. Each assignment in a course could be viewed as a project. And you could plan your work based on some of the project ideas and project methodology. Just a hint. And I think that the sooner people in an undergraduate program start thinking in those lines and start to leave high school behind them and not just think that everything should be like things were in their high school or whatever it was they were doing, the more successful you will be by thinking differently, trying to approach university studies almost as if you're an employee in a company. You're not being paid, but you're dealing with things in a more professional manner. And that means that when students start doing that, then when they do course evaluations, they tend to give constructive criticism instead of just complaining about, oh, I didn't have enough time to do this. Well, you didn't have enough time to do that because you were spending too much time on social media. If you have your social media, then you'll probably suddenly discover you have a tremendous amount of time for your university studies. So projects and courses and assignments in universities, they do have clear starts and clear ends. Courses, assignments in universities sounds like a project. They usually have a focus, or there are several related tasks packaged into one project. We can think of a course that might have an exam and might have a paper. So that's two different projects that are running in parallel. And there's an overlap. Milestones. You have an exam at a particular time. You have a paper that's going to be delivered at a particular period of time. Certain things need to be accomplished at certain times. Maybe you're supposed to you are supposed to read two other papers that other students have made and provide constructive criticism to them. That's also a milestone. Deliverables, certain kinds of things are delivered on time. Oral presentations that are completed, you have an exam, and so forth. You might have other things you might need to do. You might need to do field work. You might need to be in a laboratory. You might need to participate in seminars. There might be cases that you deal with, and those cases are helping prepare you for the exam, or they're helping you prepare for writing a paper. There are all kinds of sort of teaching and learning activities that could be involved in the course. And then we have the instructor who might be viewing the course as a project, marshalling resources together. Okay, I'm going to be away at a conference in the third week of the course, so I'm going to have one of my PhD students go in there and teach some part of that. I'm going to have to prepare the PhD student to that. Or I have a colleague who's much better at this particular topic than I am, even though I'm in charge of the course. So I'm going to talk to this person here who's going to do this for me, and then I will say, by the way, I know you have that course there, and I'm pretty good at this, so maybe I should do this for you. And we sort of swap resources there. The course has a structure, and there's a project manager. From the university perspective, we have somebody who's in charge of the course, but you are responsible for your own studies. You are your own project manager when you're participating in courses and for getting your bachelor's degree. We can own a group of students. We could have certain teachers which own a course, and sometimes a course is co-taught with more than one instructor. One may be formally in charge, but the instructors meet at some point in time before the course starts, divide up responsibilities and tasks, and so forth. And then if they're grading everything, if they divide everything up to grade, they figure out a way to try to make sure that they grade in a similar way, that not one person is grading too hard and one is grading too easily. They should be grading in a similar kind of way. And that's something which students seldom see. And we have resources. From a university perspective, of course, each course has a budget and has course planning, and the budget in terms of hours of instructors in the course and what they're going to be doing. But if there are other kinds of things, for example, if you're going to do some sort of lab, you have the facilities, and maybe the course helps to pay for that, or maybe that's paid in some other way. So from the course perspective, it's like a project. And then you, as a student, are going from one stepping stone to another through the university, from one course to the other. And you have your project, getting your degree. You have a start and you have an end, and you allocate resources. Fewer hours on social media, for example. And then that means that you have put the time and effort into this, and you've tried to plan your studies. And if you say to yourself, well, how am I supposed to be able to plan this? I've never had this course before. That's why it's good to get to know students that are 1 or 2 terms above you. You can ask them, and they might give you some tips and say, I thought this course was going to be easy and easy to plan out, but halfway through the course I realized I was mistaken. So I would think, this is my suggestion to you, do this. And then your turn can become a resource for the students who are lower down in your program. And those contacts you have between people who are not just within the year that you often have courses together with those people. If you have contacts up and below you in the program, those contacts you might want to retain for your professional life when you've left the program. If you think also about a project is getting that job after university studies, you need to marshal resources and contacts that will help you get that job, who also might be a help for you in doing that job. Because maybe you discover that you start working as an environmental manager for a particular company, and the company that you're starting to work in has a customer company, and the environmental manager in that customer company is somebody who left the same environmental studies program 2 or 3 years ago, and you happen to know that person because you consciously decided you were going to get to know people who weren't just in your cohort going through the environmental studies program, to give an example. Maybe that's a project for you who's watching this. Maybe your project during this coming term is to put a lot of effort into figuring out how, and then actually becoming sort of friends, or at least acquaintances, with people who are 1 year above you and 1 year below you in the program. A question you can ask yourself, and I'm asking you, if you were a student in a university, could this lecture be helpful during this course that you are watching this for? Or could it be helpful for other courses in the university? If you're going to be working in groups on an assignment, and you consider the assignment to be like a project, how are you going to organize yourself in the group? Are you going to say your project lasts, I'll just make this up, your project lasts 5 weeks, and there are 5 people in the group? Well, then you could have a rotating project manager. You could come together and make a plan, and then you could say that person 1 is the manager during week 1, person 2 and manager, and so forth. You are sort of collectively managing the project, but you have one person who maybe runs the meetings, and that's the project manager that week, and provides sort of summary of that. And so you take turns in some sort of collective project management. And if you would work in this way, then maybe you are better prepared for working life as an environmental professional. Hint. So in a 3 to 4 year program of university studies, you have a start and end, and you have various milestones, you have various deliverables, you have resources, you have allocation of time which is necessary. Each course you're taking or enrolled in is like a project. You are your own project manager. You decide how much time you're going to allocate from social media. Some students are well prepared from high school to succeed at universities. Others are less so. Just because you got top grades from your high school doesn't necessarily mean that you will get top grades in your university studies. Because some people planned their studies at the high school in a way that was successful, and it might require a different kind of planning at a university. What kind of steps are there in projects? Okay, you could do a Google search, and this Google search was done before AI started to pollute Google search results. Here we can see 6 steps to a foolproof project plan, 5 phases of project management, 9 steps to create a project management plan online. What are the basic project planning steps? And these are different organizations, different people that have their different ideas of doing this. I'm not going to say that one is better than another. I'm going to provide things that you can think about on coming slides, and then you can take those and make your own. I would think that if you want to sort of take a ready-made template, I think you should take one or two of them that you think sort of make sense to you, and then maybe you could practice using one or two of them in parallel and see which one you think makes sense to you, or maybe it makes sense to you and your group. You might discover certain commonalities here. And in my mind, there's a certain learning by doing that is necessary. You can read all kinds of things about project management, but if you don't approach certain tasks in life and assignments as a project, then it'll just be, shall we call it, theoretical, conceptual knowledge about projects. You need to have practical knowledge, hands-on trying to do that. And if you arrange a project in a particular way and think, well, it was pretty good, but maybe I should have done it differently, then you'll start saying to yourself, okay, I tried one of these, that didn't work so well, let me try another one there. Because I don't think there's anything which is foolproof, because all projects are a bit unique, and there are longer periods of time, and there could be more people involved, and as we saw in the previous slide, that projects can have larger or lesser degrees of autonomy from a parent organization. And of course, you as a student, you are your own project manager, so to speak. But if you are working in groups on assignments from time to time, then that's a different way of being in a project, where you have competing wills and competing ideas, and people with perhaps different kinds of knowledge and skills that they bring to the project. Whereas if you're on your own, well, then you maybe know your own strengths and weaknesses. As an instructor at university who has a number of courses that the instructor is in charge of each year, you start to develop some sort of project management way of working with courses, and there could also be that you are required to allocate people that will be working in your course to be co-teaching with you, and you need to do that at a particular period of time because people need to know what they're going to be doing. Somebody might have gotten money for a research project and won't have time to help you in that course, and so forth. You have to plan accordingly. And by doing this for 1 year or 2 or 3 terms, then the instructor in a particular university becomes quite competent in doing this, and if they move to another university, there will be some sort of similarity about doing this. I have a long list here about generic ideas about the planning steps and the execution of the project. But I thought I would go down to just the planning steps. Here are some questions that you need to ask yourself in the beginning. You, or perhaps other people. If you are not going to be the project manager or participate in the project, but maybe you are in some kind of an oversight group that's going to create some sort of, it's going to answer some kind of questions. So, what is going to be accomplished? If I'm going to be the project manager, a question I have to ask, who wants us to do this? What is the frame in terms of resources and time and so forth? Have I been given goals, or I've been given very vague goals, and I need to make more concrete goals? I need to order these goals and prioritize them among one another. Some goals are more important. Some goals require another goal to be achieved. This leads to the idea of deliverables. What is going to be delivered by who and when? Now, when you make your planning steps here, it could be that at some point during the execution of the project you realize that you need to make some sort of change. But if you didn't have a plan, then you're in bad shape. I mean, when Amundsen was going to the South Pole, his plan, he had in his mind X number of dogs, and that they would establish a sort of one or more bases along the way, so they wouldn't have to take all their things with them all the way to the South Pole. They would drop some of it off for their return journey. And his plan was that there would be X number of people that would go with him. Maybe it was 4, 5, or 6 people. And that as he experienced, some people he was very clear about who was going to go with him. And as he experienced people on his boat going south to Antarctica, he might have then selected more specifically which people would he actually be taking with him. Perhaps based on skills, but also perhaps based on the personality within the group. Because it was going to be difficult, and you would need to have people that would help bear each other's burdens and would would be level-headed in face of problems, but at the same time not bottle up all their emotions and then have it suddenly explode. You need to have a certain personality type where this would work. Is there going to be an oversight group? Maybe you are in the oversight group that is at the start of the planning steps before you've actually decided who's going to be the project manager and so forth. But you're going to have some kind of ideas about who's going to be the manager and who's going to be in the team, preferably. And you want to create some sort of a framework. We could call it a skeleton with the time, the stages, and the deliverables. And then, if you're the project manager who's been given this task, then you need to present that project idea to the owners, the oversight group. It could be the oversight group has actually done this and then presents this to the project manager, or maybe interviews potential project managers. Almost like. So once the planning stage is over, then we move on to the actual execution of the project. And this list is essentially what a project manager needs to be dealing with. We have a meeting with the team members at some point, the representatives of the stakeholders, or an oversight group. And then there's the actual work which is taking place, and then we have the manager doing managerial functions, following up what's been happening, reporting to the project owners, perhaps reprioritization from time to time. There are deadlines that need to be met, or you need to make sure that other people meet their deadlines. There's probably a final report, there's some evaluation, and you might also be involved in providing some sort of input into some sort of next project or a spin-off, and at some point the project actually ends. Something which we can find in essentially all projects is that there are, as I've mentioned before, deliverables and milestones, particular things on the way, but the project will have one or more overarching goals, and some of the goals will be found in the deliverables, and there'll be a milestone to achieve certain things, and there'll be goals in that as well. But what kind of goals are they? Something which is linked to the idea of project management and projects are what are sometimes referred to as SMART goals. And SMART goals, the idea of SMART goals was originally from the 1980s. And you'll see in the reference the specific article where it's from. SMART goals, and it's great to have a list of important points and that they form a word, S-M-A-R-T. SMART goals are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. And you can find in various kinds of literature since the 1980s variations on SMART goals. There might be other terms used, but they essentially mean the same thing here. And there might be some authors that have added one or two other words to the list. For example, there are so-called smarter goals, where the E is ethical and the R is recognizable. It's not all that important exactly which sort of school of goal setting that you choose. But I'll continue talking about SMART goals here, because this is one that is used very frequently, and that means it would be good to know what is meant by that. When it comes to SMART goals, we have specific, the S. And the reason we need to have specific goals is that if you have a vague goal, it will be interpreted differently by different people that are in the project, and perhaps people outside of the project, and that can lead to a problem. We need to make sure that everybody involved in the project is working with a common understanding and moving in the direction of the same goals, the same sort of a target. If we have vague goals, then that's not going to work, and we're going to lose time along the way. We could have person A who has been paying attention to a vague goal and is interpreted in their way, and person B, the vague goal, interpreted in their own way, and they're working along, and at some point a year later they come together and they realize they've not been doing the same thing. They've not had the same sort of picture about what's going to happen here. So therefore we need to have specific goals as part of the SMART goals. If we have specific goals, then that means that they're probably going to be measurable. We need to be measuring to be able to measure the goal. That means we probably need to have a quantifiable goal. It can be expressed in numbers. One of the reasons we want to have something measurable is if we can't measure the goal, we may never really know whether we've reached it. Also, by making a measurable goal, we're probably more likely to have something which is specific. If we have a vague goal along the lines that we want to have the highest quality brand in this geographic market. Well, what does highest quality mean? If we want to have something that's more specific and more measurable, maybe it would be that 9 out of 10 customers buying things in this particular market, this particular niche here, will identify us as having high quality. That's something which is measurable and something which is very specific. How are we going to know if we've succeeded in our project of achieving goals if they're not measurable? That would be a problem. Which means that specific and measurable goals, they tend to be quantitative, they tend to be easier to grasp. So there's less room for interpretation along the way and everything is very clear. We also have to have achievable goals. It doesn't make sense to have goals that we probably will not be able to achieve. We have to have relevant goals. They have to be relevant for the project, or if it's not part of a project, have to be relevant to the overall objectives and the overall strategies and vision in the organization, or if it's a project-based goal, in the project. And then finally, they have to be time-bound. Since projects have ends, and there are certain things that are expected at certain times along the way towards the end of the project. So all our goals have to be very specifically timed. If we have something that during a particular week the goal is this will be achieved, well then if we achieve it on Monday or Friday, it doesn't really matter, perhaps. But if the goal is part of something which is a deliverable which will be then sent on to somebody else, then you better be sure that you have an exact date for that, so that you are done with your part and turn it over to somebody else. So SMART goals, these are often talked about in an organization or in a project you might be involved in. It isn't necessarily the case that everyone will be talking about SMART goals, but it's a good idea to be familiar with what is meant by SMART goals. And it could be a good idea to use SMART goals as your way of thinking about what sort of goals you want to have in whatever kind of endeavor you're doing. Moving on to project management. What is it that a project manager does? We already saw there that the project manager may be involved in the planning process, or the project manager may inherit everything and then follow the plan and try to make sure that the deliverables are delivered in time and that there are these goals, and reprioritize things as necessary. If something seems to be taking more time to achieve than things that are achieved more quickly, maybe we can redevote resources in terms of people and money, or whatever resources that will be required there. So project managers sometimes are trying to get people to do things that they might otherwise not do or not prioritize. Because typically a person might be involved in one or more projects, and they might have their everyday work they're supposed to be doing, and then they're involved in projects. And how are they going to decide which one of these they are going to prioritize in any given day or any given week? Presumably the project manager is providing some sort of inspiration, and not just at some sort of a kickoff meeting, but as necessary as time continues. My experience in being in various kinds of projects is there tends to be a lot of inspiration in the beginning, and then it just sort of gets ground down. But it depends upon the project, and we understand there are different kinds of projects and there might be different kinds of project managers. And the project manager has to ensure that the employees are actually given the time that they need that has been promised to work in the project, and that those people have the resources they need, so that several employees can do something a bit different than what they're otherwise doing during that time frame that they're involved in the project. A project manager has a lot of communications and can have a lot of time spending in negotiations. Particularly if we imagine a project manager where there are several different organizations involved and you are part of one parent organization, and that you have some sort of group of owners or an oversight group. And there might be something which is going to be difficult to deliver. Maybe we could negotiate with others to accept something that wasn't exactly what was anticipated that it should be or planned on being, perhaps. There's a lot of following up and administration. The previous decisions were made, we follow them up. We follow up the results if things are timely. Project managers execute a certain amount of power, but that needs to be done wisely, so that you don't get people sort of against you in your project management responsibility. My cousin has a term she likes to use, herding cats. If we imagine cats, they usually don't like to be told what to do. So the project manager in some circumstances is sort of herding a group of cats and keeping them moving in the direction, keeping them working on what they're supposed to be doing in a timely fashion. Sometimes a project is planned out well enough, and at least initially is managed well enough, and the project manager doesn't have to do much of these difficulties. It's more like a well-oiled machine, and you just need to check up on things from time to time, and that you actually don't have to spend a lot of time being a project manager for large parts of the time the project has been running. If everybody is clear on what they're supposed to do, and we have the SMART goals, and it was planned well, and the planners had good expectations, then it just becomes a question of maintaining direction and tempo. Now, if some of these things aren't there, then the project manager won't have a well-oiled machine to take over and to be responsible for. How about another perspective? And now we're moving in the direction of sustainability. We have this document here. Yes. So there's a document from 2019. You can see the source here. Looked at and had contributors for people that worked with various kinds of projects for sustainability, whatever that means. It's about a 300-page document. This document and other sources will be appearing in the list of references at the end. One of the things they say on page 7, our point of departure is that projects are nothing but temporarily interconnected people. That's a way of looking at it. But what makes a difference is what can be done to the project in itself, and they claim that there are 3 important virtues, the ABCs of project making. And they deal with this in the various chapters in this 300-page document. Building good relationships is affinity, having the guts to make change, bravery, showing willingness to learn, curiosity. And these are the basis for a successful execution of future sustainability projects. And what characterizes a sustainability project according to the document? Sustainability projects are complex, unpredictable, and there's a certain amount of desperation, according to the editors and authors here. And this ABCs, we can see there's some sort of similarity to what was talked about in the previous slide, looking at the execution of the project with the project manager. Lots of communication, lots of negotiation. Perhaps not so much bravery there and willingness to learn specifically, but this is another kind of perspective looking at what projects are, and specifically projects for sustainability on page 7 in this document. Let's go one step further. Let's look at another part of the document. This is from page 19. Let's look a little closer here. They say, we are accustomed to projects. Well, at least some of us are. Projects are everywhere, and everything is basically a project. We have learned how to deal with projects for better or worse. Some of us love projects. Some of us are fed up with them. A nice way of saying hate them. But projects, whatever we think, are here to stay, and that's one of the reasons why you are paying attention, hopefully, to this presentation, this video presentation, a video essay. Projects are nothing new, and you heard about that earlier in my presentation. But what has changed is that projects have become fine-tuned. To be able to do a project today, we need to be trained in project management, either formally or have participated enough in projects. And what other kind of words do we find here? Project leadership, spreadsheets, Gantt charts or Gantt diagrams, and I'll be getting back to them in a bit. Swim lanes, Kanban, Scrum, waterfalls, sprints, deliverables, and so forth. All kinds of terminology that are sometimes used. And some people are familiar with Scrums, and you can get a title as a Scrum Master and so forth, particularly if you're working with the development of software or apps, if you like, is a typical way of doing this. And as they say, have you noticed a pattern yet? Becoming a project manager has become a sort of an occupational category in and of itself. So we have people that go around that become from one project to another and a project manager, and they actually don't know all that much about the specifics of that sort of knowledge area that the project is dealing with, but they know how to run projects. And sometimes working with environmental matters becomes working in projects. And if you're interested in having a career as an environmental professional, some sort of understanding of projects and project management is probably essential. On the other hand, as they say, projects are full of pitfalls. Not enough resources. Scope creep. In other words, originally the project was going to do this, and as the project is carrying on, and we have new stakeholders added into it, or new project managers, or new oversight groups, that they want a project to do more, which sort of defeats the purpose, because the project was supposed to have a clear focus and smart goals, and now suddenly somebody's changing this. Lack of interest from stakeholders, or somebody's just not paying attention to warning signs that some are the reasons why projects fail. If you're interested in this, I invite you to get a hold of this document. I don't think that there's any reason to read all 300 pages in it, but you might sort of skip around in the first 20, 25 pages, and there might be a chapter that sounds interesting. You might want to look at that to sort of broaden your understanding what a project is. I could have had a much longer video presentation, but you probably don't want that. So who ends up being a project manager? What kind of background and experiences do people who are project managers in general have? You could imagine people that have never formally been running a project before, but have had a central role in a project, and then they become elevated to a project manager. This is probably somebody who has worked in a particular area and dealt with projects similar to the actual project they become project manager in. You could have somebody who has taken an educational program in a university about project management or elsewhere, and then that was their sort of education. That's what they got their degree in. Somebody who has a lot of work experience relevant to the project but doesn't have all that much experience being a project manager itself. But often what happens is that you have a number of people who have been project managers who have a lot of experience, and now they get a new role in a new project and they have a new challenge. But you're probably not going to start working as a project manager right off the mat as the first thing you do after leaving university, unless you got a degree in project management or a degree that included a lot of project management in it. One of the things mentioned in the document about sustainability and projects was a Gantt diagram or a Gantt chart. This is a very simplified version of a Gantt diagram or a Gantt chart. And we can see that on the bottom we have time, we have week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, and then we have various kinds of stages, and we have things that are going to be done at different times of the week. And that one stage leads to another, or that there is a sort of a sub-stage or some sort of else that is a part of that. So each of those stages is that something happens during that particular period of time. If we look further, if you use Microsoft Office, there are templates to make Gantt charts. And so you have the template and then you just add the information there. And if this was a real long, complex project that was being sort of mapped out or planned using a Gantt chart, let's suppose here that we've done a number of things here and we reach a point here where the group of people or groups of people that have been doing things for a number of weeks, they reach some sort of point, they have something they deliver to the next group. That would be that you would see something that would sort of fall through the chart and reach a new group of people that will be further down the chart. And in a real Gantt chart, there can be specific symbols showing that there's some sort of a change here. They don't have to all be rectangles. But there are other templates that you can use in other kind of software. I'm just trying to show how ubiquitous this is. Now, the thing about sustainability in projects, of course, is that at least from some perspectives, like from the environmental studies program perspective, which I teach in, we could view sustainability as a utopian vision, and it would be based on fairness and future human generations. And to achieve sustainability, it would be that we would have sustainable development, and that could then be the path and process and the direction of the utopian vision. However, regardless of how we view this, whether sustainability is the vision and sustainable development is what we do to achieve the vision or try to achieve the vision, I think we can all agree on that sustainability and sustainable development is something which is long-term and which be something which should fundamentally affect all kinds of organizations. The vision and strategy of the organizations, that organization's relationships with the rest of society on a market or outside of a market and so forth. Now, not everyone might necessarily agree with everything here, but humor me for the moment. Let's assume for the moment that sustainability is this vision, and a utopian vision is seldom something that we actually achieve. We could try to reach that. And sustainable development could be the path and process and the direction of that utopian vision. So regardless, this seems like something that's going to take a long time, and it's going to affect all kinds of organizations, but perhaps affecting the organizations in different ways. So, sustainability, sustainable development is long-term and should fundamentally affect all kinds of organizations. On the other hand, there are lots of projects that exist, and you might be involved in one at some point in time, and they are described as being sustainable or contributing to sustainability. But since projects tend to be short-term, there were some notable exceptions we heard about before, but they tend to be short-term, time-bound, and sustainability is long-term and not necessarily time-bound. What we see here is that projects in sustainable development or sustainability are actually very different. They're thought of in very different ways. And what we see here is what we could call the projectification of sustainable development. We're taking something which is long-term and should make fundamental changes to all kinds of organizations and change processes. But instead, we're chopping that idea up into something very short-term and time-bound, the very antithesis of what sustainability would be. And this means, if we're going to be an organization that says we are sustainable, we're going to reach sustainability, and we have a project that we call sustainable development, and we have another project, and we have another project, and another project, and we pile them all on top of each other and say, so look, we're on the way to achieving sustainable development or sustainability. We're never going to reach it with a series of small, narrow, focused, short-term projects. Unless those projects are specifically designed with certain processes in mind in our organization to make changes in those processes. In business as usual, we have a project. But that's not the way many projects are. Projects are very specific, time-bound, a limited kind of focus, whereas sustainability is sort of the opposite. And we could ask the question, as I'm asking, could it be that all this projectification of sustainable development functions as a way for an organization, whatever organization, they can point to specific projects when they're actually not changing all that much? And it's not all that dissimilar if we look at if we look at the history of how organizations in the 1960s and 1970s started dealing with environmental problems. Oh no. And it took them a long time to actually start dealing with their core activities, the goods and services that they offer on a market. Everything else was sort of dancing around their environmental problems, which was themselves. And we can look back and we can see how organizations in the past would say that we're not involved in this. Our facility couldn't have caused all these dead fish that we see there. And then these kinds of organizations spend a long time building higher chimneys, that's like a project, or having longer pipes. They transform a local air pollution problem into a regional air pollution problem. And I'm sure that was very exciting to be a part of that. And the dead fish occur someplace else, not near the factory. When we all understand that the actual problem, the environmental problem, is here, this is just a symptom of the problem, which is the organization itself. So these were projects which the organization carried out, sort of external to its processes and the way it should be working. So one can wonder if we don't see a parallel with the projectification of sustainable development, that organizations are working in a similar way and they're not really grasping the central problems, and they're just doing something which looks good for everybody on the outside, while having to actually deal with specific problems. And sustainability, of course, is a problem, and there's a lot of desperation, it's complex, and there's uncertainty. And this is a way to sort of summarize how businesses worked with environmental problems in the past: denying dilution, moving the problem, recycling, reducing waste, a lot of industrial symbiosis, what's been called cleaner production, sometimes what is referred to as extended producer responsibility, and that everyone's favorite phrase on everyone's lips today, circular economy, and so forth. And we see that there are some things that are changed, but the products themselves are not really changed. And then once we've put something on the market, it's up to the green consumers to decide whether they're going to do this or not. So not much changes. Everything is sort of business as usual. At least that's the way it was in the past. So what about me and projects? I have some experience working in various kinds of projects, and I also have experience watching other organizations as they increasingly become a project-oriented kind of organization. I've worked within 2 universities with various kinds of functions. I listen to occasional lectures and seminars on the part of researchers and teachers in the area of leadership and organization, part of my university. So I have some sort of theory, but I have some sort of practice working with some things. And here were the academic references. Here's some questions which I invite you to reflect on. How do you view projects now after watching this video essay? Have you been involved in a project? If you've been involved in a project in the past but not realized this at the time, now after this video essay you perhaps recognize that you were in a project. Do you agree or disagree with the relationship suggested in this video essay that project-based efforts at sustainable development are the wrong way to reach sustainability? Consider the timescale of a project and the timescale of sustainability. What about instead a mix of making changes in processes, in other words, changing existing structures and routines, and carrying out some projects all together in an effort to reach sustainability? That might make more sense. Perhaps you need to, or might like to, reflect on your knowledge about projects and project management, and there might be something more that you think you need to learn about projects and project management. You could be watching this video presentation as part of a course, and there's no more room in this course to deal with projects and project management. And you might want to consider, if you're outside the course, what kind of digital resources there might be that could help you with this. If you who are watching this are specifically an environmental studies student at Malmö University, how are you going to put this lecture to use in the rest of your time at the university? You might be able to approach courses as if they were projects, or you might be able to approach in the future your bachelor's thesis as if it was a project, with some of the things that you've heard here, and apply that. And of course, if you've never tried to work with a project and project management until you reach your bachelor's thesis, then it might feel very daunting and not very helpful. So you might want to practice on some sort of course before you reach your final term and start working with your bachelor's thesis. Just an idea for your consideration. Thanks for watching, and I hope you found this presentation of value.